Today, I'm overlooking the Kidron Valley on the east side of Jerusalem, with the Temple Mount and the City of David over there, and the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane over there. The two most famous characters of the Bible made this journey, both in tears, both rejected as king, both abandoned by all but a few friends. The major difference? One walked this direction, away from the city, to save his life, and the other walked this direction, toward the city, to give his life. Let's walk in their footsteps today on the trail of King David. When David's about 60 years old, his own son, Absalom, starts a rebellion. He gathers followers, crowns himself king, and David has to flee for his life again on this road from Jerusalem down into the Kidron Valley. On the other side of the Kidron Valley is the Mount of Olives, named for the olive groves that once covered this side of the mountain, both in David's time and 1,000 years later in Jesus' time. There are still a few olive groves left. Some of these trees may be as old as 2,000 years. And it's here that it says in 2 Samuel 15:30, David walked up the road to the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. David's 60 years old, and he is again on the run. And in an interesting parallel, the Bible says Jesus also wept when he crested the Mount of Olives 1,000 years after David. And here in an olive grove up on the Mount of Olives, I want to draw some parallels between the Mount of Olives moment for David and the Mount of Olives moment for Jesus. David wept over his rebellious child, Absalom, and Jesus wept over his rebellious children, the children of Israel. David was betrayed by one of his own closest counselors, Ahithophel. Jesus was betrayed by one of his disciples, Judas. Some of the only people who stay with David are his personal bodyguard, some of his family members, and then 600 Gentiles. In fact, they are Philistines from, of all places, Gath. Does that name ring a bell? That was the hometown of Goliath. And yet these Philistines from Gath honor David and call him my Lord and my King. They follow him when some of his own people reject him as king. And again, that foreshadows Jesus and how when some of his own rejected him, Gentiles embraced him. Another parallel in sort of the ultimate surrender to God. David says, if the Lord sees fit, he'll bring me back. But if he's through with me, then let him do as seems best to him. And also here on the Mount of Olives, Jesus prays that famous prayer, Father, if you are willing, take this cup of suffering away from me. Nevertheless, your will, not my will, be done. That's basically the same prayer both times. You know, when you're suffering or when a loved one's going through a tough time, that can be one of the toughest prayers to pray, but it's really the ultimate prayer of faith. God, whatever your will is, that's what I want. I mean, here's my request. Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done, because I trust that you know best. And David really elaborates on that prayer in a psalm he apparently wrote at about this time in his life, Psalm 62. This is about what you do, what I do, when times are so tough that even some loved ones, maybe even family members, are betraying us. Now, of course, I pray that never happens to you, but it might. What do you do in times like that? Well, David shows us what to do here in these verses. You know, the temptation is to stay in a negative place where I respond to everything with negative, reactive emotion. And David certainly does that at some times. He allows some of his venom to just spew out when he vents to God. But don't stay in that place. Psalm 62 shows him in a real place of serenity, and this is an amazing example of how to find peace for my soul when things are out of control. David says, I wait patiently before God, for my victory comes from Him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress where I will never be shaken. So many enemies against one man, all of them trying to kill me. To them, I'm just a broken down wall or a tottering fence. He's saying they think I'm old and weak. They plan to topple me from my high position. They delight in telling lies about me. They praise me to my face, but curse me in their hearts. So what's he going to do about it? Let all that I am wait quietly before God. For my hope is in Him. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress where I will not be shaken. My victory and honor come from God alone. He is my refuge, a rock where no enemy can reach me. Notice how several times he describes God here again as rock and fortress and refuge. Now, in his younger days, David literally, as we've seen, had to hide among the rocks in caves. This particular time, the Bible says he flees across the Jordan River and he stays in the home of a wealthy Ammonite man who makes him and his men pretty comfortable. But regardless, whether I'm staying in a literal cave and am literally homeless, or if I'm staying in a home, it's God who is my actual rock, my actual fortress, my actual hiding place the whole time. I have to remember not to place my trust in people or in places because they can betray me or fail me. I place all my trust in God as the fortress of my soul. O my people, trust in Him at all times. Pour out your heart to Him, for God is your refuge. God has spoken plainly, and I've heard it many times. Power, O God, belongs to you. Unfailing love, O Lord, is yours. And again, you see here how David turns to these two truths about God over and over: God's sovereignty and God's grace. He is the source of power and of love. And then he ends with one little line, one important truth: surely you repay all people according to what they have done. In other words, I know that God will ultimately see and repay. Now you got to realize David doesn't just sit and kind of contemplate his navel and wait for God to deliver him. He takes whatever action he can. He actually puts spies in Absalom's court. He has somebody inside Absalom's inner circle feeding Absalom disinformation. So David does what he can to stop the rebellion, yet his hope is not in his own schemes. His ultimate hope is in God, exactly like what you and I should do in times of distress. We take action that we can take. We do whatever we can do, but it's trust in God's sovereign grace that gets us to a place of serenity instead of a place of reactive, negative emotion. Now, eventually the rebellion is put down and David returns to his palace in Jerusalem. We'll get there next time. But first, I want to stay on Jesus's Mount of Olives moment for a minute. As Jesus crests the hill in this same spot coming toward Jerusalem, people are starting to line the road with palm branches, cheering him on. Jesus is riding a donkey down the valley into the city through the Golden Gate, which you can see in the wall of the Temple Mount. It's now blocked up. And when Jesus rides in, he's proclaimed as the Messiah, the new David, the new king. But Jesus knows this is only because the people hope he will be a literal political king and kick out the current leaders, when instead Jesus kicks the vendors out of the court of the Gentiles at the temple to make room for more Gentiles. People are disappointed, and the corrupt and unscrupulous temple leadership in league with the Romans stokes the anger of the mob in order to rid themselves of this heir to David's throne, and he's crucified. But Jesus is not finished. 3 days later, on the other side of the city, he's seen alive again. And he makes it clear he's here to bring a new kind of kingdom, not one with a physical throne and city walls and national borders, but a kingdom of the Spirit, lives changed by God's grace. And that is how God's promise, God's covenant with David is ultimately fulfilled. His promise that the house of David would endure forever. Because this descendant of David, Jesus, begins a kingdom far larger than anything David could ever have imagined. A movement that has touched lives on every continent for 2,000 years. One major contrast between David and Jesus: David walked this direction, away from the city to save his life. Jesus walked this direction, toward the city, to willingly give his life, because he was forging a new and future trail of King David.